and begin. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another author interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. And joining us today is another author making their official debut here on the show. Now, my guest today lives in Central California with his family. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in creative writing from California State University, Monterey Bay, and an MAR from Liberty University Theological Seminary, focusing on biblical studies. He's working on his sixth book in his fantasy series while continually creating new content for his YouTube series and hosting the Storytellers podcast. And in addition to his Storytellers podcast, he's also co-host of War of the Stars, a Star Wars podcast. So let's give a huge round of applause to today's guest, author and publisher, Mr. Garrett K. Jones. Garrett, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome, Garrett. Well, I'm so excited to have you here. And funnily enough, I heard about your channel as well as your profile on Instagram from a friend of mine whose book I believed you did a review on by Days Evander, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
I didn't do the review. I interviewed her for my Author Awareness April Marathon. So every April I do a marathon of episodes where each week is a different author that I'm interviewing. And so I got to feature her for the third interview of this year's marathon. And it was a real pleasure. I'm actually in the process of finishing up her book, and I'm really enjoying it.
Same here. She's an incredible writer, an incredible author. I actually had her on my show, I want to say last year. And let me tell you, Garrett, that was a long time coming because I've been trying to have her on my show for almost a year and a half. But I'm glad that you had her on your show because she is such an amazing author. And you, Garrett, are equally an incredible interviewer, I must say.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
No problem, Garrett. So let's dive right into some of the first starting questions. So is there anything more you'd like to add about your background? Anything that wasn't covered?
No, I mean, you pretty much covered a lot of it. I mean, my background in writing started when I was a kid. I think a lot of other authors make similar statements along that line. And I knew it was something that I wanted to do. It was something I wanted to pursue. There were some moments when I was in college where I considered doing a complete career overhaul with my degree and all that. Almost switched into doing law enforcement, or considered switching to psychology, but I didn't, and I stuck with writing, and here I am.
Awesome. And speaking of writing, without giving too much away, because from your bio, you are currently working on the next book in your series. As a teaser for the viewers and listeners, what can you tell us about this series, as well as the first book and the book you're currently working on now?
Okay, so the series itself, it's called The Archives of Async Ran, which means the Five Kingdoms, Archives of the Five Kingdoms, which is kind of the central location where everything takes place. And so I like to, one of my pitches when I'm doing public events is that I say it's like Lord of the Rings, but with less walking. It's like Game of Thrones with less graphic content. And so, but I also pitch it as it's got dragons, elves, magic, and vampires that don't sparkle.
Ooh, okay, I like that. And what's currently, I know you, again, don't want to spoil too much,
Yeah.
but what is the current book you are working on as a teaser?
So everything stems from the first book. Everything that takes place in book one leads to the events of books 2, 3, 4, 5, and then later on 6. Everything's consequential, both good and bad. So the first book deals with the resurgence of a tyrannical despot's
Ooh.
heir. And he says that he's got these heirs that are going to finish what he started 250 years before the story starts. But no heirs are ever found. They have no idea what they're looking for. And so eventually everything just kind of calms down. There's peace in the land for 2.5 centuries. And then stuff starts hitting the fan because these heirs who were strategically positioned in responsible leadership roles are now working together to complete their father's work. And their father had been instrumental in nearly eradicating all dragons. So dragons are kind of an endangered species in my series. So there are several dragons, but they're few and far between. And then there's a lot of interconnectivity between the different species or races in the series, especially between a celestial race that created everything, as well as elves, humans, vampires, dragons, and everything in between. And just it's kind of my way of saying that the people and entities that populate this world are way more interconnected than they realize. And so everything else that happens in book 2 through the current one that I'm working on now is all the result of the consequences that come about in book 1.
Wow, nice. And I also love how you said in the beginning how, you know, it's Lord of the Rings minus the walking, Game of Thrones minus the graphical content, and also all the mythological beings are dangerous and don't sparkle, which I know quite a few friends are going to absolutely love that. Especially one of my friends who's a big vampire writer and enthusiast. He has a clear disdain for the sparkle vampire, so he's going to get a kick out of this.
Yeah, in fact, my whole thing with the vampires, I mean, they start off very much like the traditional Carpathian style vampires, very dark, very, you know, they live underground. They like, I don't have dwarves in my series. I mean, dwarves exist, but for lack of a better term, they are basically extinct. And the vampires in my series have basically taken over their mines and caverns as their place. So, and the vampires in my series they're dying essentially because because you've got a race of beings that are entirely predatory. It's very easy to ward them off. People know what they're looking for. And so they have a ton of weaknesses. Eventually, when they can't prey on their food source, they start dying off. And like there's a scene in book 3 where the protagonist, who's a character from book 1, he goes in search of the vampires because he wants to do something to help them. And he comes upon a vampire that has become so blood starved that she has essentially started feeding on herself and she's starting to look skeletal.
Ooh.
And so instead of having like some kind of weird mutation to it, it's just like her body is going into hibernation mode. And so that's one of the drawbacks of being vampires. So like if all the vampires continue to go without any blood, they shrivel up and go into hibernation mode.
Fascinating. So before we dive more into this series, Garrett, let's talk a little bit more about you. So as you said early on that you've always been a writer, and as you went into university, college, you were offered many different paths to go into either, you know, sociology or in other fields, but you stuck with creative writing. Now I'm curious, did someone instill this passion for writing in you, or was this something that was naturally already part of your being?
I've always had a creative spark. So like so as a kid growing up, I mean, I grew up in the early to mid 80s initially, and Star Wars was a big thing before it became a big thing again. And the toys were sometimes hard to find. And I did have some of the action figures that Kenner made back in the 80s, but I had few and far between. And so I took a lot of other toys that I had that were smaller in scale, but I had a lot more of the vehicles for those play sets, and I just pretended that they were something else. And then later on, I got into, like, when Power Rangers became a big thing in the early 90s, I did something similar. And so I would get shoe boxes and like the foam inserts that you had for like toy packaging and whatnot. I would use those and cut them up to make bases and fortresses and stuff like that. And in third grade, one of my teachers had us do a writing project where we watched through the original 1990 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie, the live action one,
Right.
the best one. And the prompt that we got after watching the movie was, you go to New York and you meet the Ninja Turtles, what happens? And so I wrote this really cool story, and it kind of just jump started me. And then as I got into middle school, I started writing fan fiction for the things that I was really into. So X-Men, Batman, Power Rangers was a big thing for me. And eventually I started developing my own characters. And then my sophomore year of high school, I was taking a theater class, and one of our assignments was to participate in writing a story and present and doing like a verbal oral storytelling presentation to the class. And for extra credit, we could sign up for a storytelling competition that was going to be hosted on our campus. I signed up and I ended up taking second place.
Not bad.
And elements from that story, which is called The Council of Dragons, were later worked into my book series.
Fascinating. Now, would you consider that aha moment in a sense you realize you had something that was there and you wanted to expand on it and grow your career as an author, or did that come later after you graduated from college?
It was kind of somewhere in between. So like when I was in high school, during that sophomore year, I started developing all these characters because my goal at some point was to become a comic book writer. And I started designing all these characters, and a lot of them were very derivative of characters that existed in pop culture up to that point.
Right.
And so eventually, a couple years down the line, I was living in Japan as an exchange student, and there's so much creativity. There's so much culture there that influenced a lot of what I was coming up with and writing and stuff like that. And I had always been like really interested in folklore. And so I kind of delved into that, and I took the concept for these characters and I said, these would work better in a medieval fantasy storytelling element rather than modern superheroes. And so I started revamping and retooling the characters, and eventually what I did is I wrote them into what became the first iteration of my series, which at the time was only going to be 3 books. Each book was going to be separated by about 20 years of time, so that it was going to be generational with the characters. And then I finished writing the bulk of the first book while I was overseas. Finished writing it during my first semester of college when I came back. And then I kind of got bored with that original version because the original version was just not great. I had like 9 protagonists that were all introduced all up front. I had 1 antagonist that didn't make any sense. And so what I ended up doing is I took core elements and I reworked it. And so going back to what I had in those original notebooks, there are some elements that landed right into the first book. There were elements from a story I had written during my freshman year of high school that took one of those characters and kept it in the traditional superhero motif, but I took it and I revamped it because it was supposed to be a larger part of book 1, and I ended up separating it out and making it its own book for book 2. And so that same plot line for that story that I wrote freshman year came in place for book 2 and worked out really nicely. So I don't get rid of anything for the most part, but I tend to circle back to things and I recycle them in a way that I think will work better. Like there's an element from that original version of my series where I had a character who becomes a Wendigo.
Ah, okay.
And I ended up scrapping that through the first 4 books, and I ended up bringing that story arc back for a particular character in book 5. Now I don't say that the character is a Wendigo. I tweak it just a little bit. The element is there, the danger is there, but it's not quite the exact same myth. So I had a lot of fun with it, and actually writing that particular story arc was emotional because of what happens with that particular character.
Absolutely. And, that was kind of the same thing I did for one of my stories. So when I actually started writing, just like you, I started writing in high school as well. My first story was called The Warriors of the Moon. And then from Warriors of the Moon, I finished the story, but I was like, it's not really the best. So I shelved it and decided I'll get back to it later. Well, fast forward, I want to say about 10, maybe 10, 15 years. Well, maybe not 15 years, more like about, I want to say maybe 6 or 7 years. And then I wrote my first book, The Gathering, and it had elements of time travel. That's like, I'm going to combine elements from my first story, Warriors of the Moon, and integrate it into the lore. And unknowingly, I made Warriors of the Moon a prequel to The Gathering. And now it's like, well, I'm referencing the first book. Now I got to actually write it. So that is actually pretty funny. But, one of the many benefits and traits of us authors is that we will always steal from ourselves and make something new, which, that's part of the fun thing. We are storytellers and we create new things from everyday situations around us or from old stories. And speaking of stories, let's actually now dive into the creation of your series, Garrett. So walk me through it. You're now working on the first book in this series of yours. You're in front of your computer, or maybe you have a pad and paper with you, and you're writing the story down. Now, with everything you have at that time, what were the goals you had going into this project as the author, as well as the promises making to your future readers?
So the goals that I had was basically to finish the story and get it done to a level that I enjoyed it. Because initially when I started writing the original version in Japan, like everything was being handwritten in notebooks. I went through close to a dozen or more notebooks, back and front, handwriting everything. And so when I went back into transcribe it into a computer, because I didn't have access to a computer at the time, when I went back in to transcribe it, the process was so tedious and so boring for me because by that point, I had already read the story.
Right.
And I'm one of those readers where very rarely do I read a book and then pick it up for a second or third read. Usually the idea for the story sticks in my head long enough where I don't have to go back and reread it. So that became part of the problem with me is I got bored with this original iteration. And I think subconsciously there was part of me that realized it wasn't that great. Like the concepts were cool, but the execution was weak. And so I went back in and I started redrafting it, and the bulk of the story just kind of wrote itself when I went back and redrafted things. I kept things simple. I stuck with 3 main protagonists, 3 antagonists, keeping everything balanced. And I just kind of worked off of that idea of keeping things simple and to the point. I didn't want to info dump a bunch of stuff about the world and like show everything all at once. In fact, the first book keeps things curtailed to like like the eastern half of the Five Kingdoms, and
Right.
and so you only see very little of it. And so like with each book, I've added more of the world to it so that readers get introduced to it with the character. But then in the writing process, I had to revamp what I was doing, because sometimes I would I was writing this through college, and some of the scenes would kind of just hit me in the middle of the night, where like at 2 o'clock in the morning I can't sleep, and I'm like, here's the idea. And so I just get on my computer and I just start typing away, and I type until I had like 10, 15 pages. But then the rest of the time I was writing sections of it in a notebook.
Mhm.
Meanwhile, as I'm finishing up, I had finished up writing book one, and it sat there on my computer for the longest time. And I started getting this idea for book two.
Mm.
And the idea for book two, like I said, it came from a story that I'd written in high school. And so I revamped the story, reworked the characters for what I was doing, and kept things in line with the first book. And this was supposed to be a section of book one, but it was so long and so large, it needed its own section. It needed to be its own thing. And so I went through, and with that, the way that was working is I was handwriting out my chapters, and I would go chapter by chapter, and then I would type it up. And that seemed to flow way better for me. And then I came with book two, while I was in the middle of writing it, I started coming up with ideas for book three and how I wanted that to do. And so like it was all kind of just flowing. And then, but I hit this wall with book three, and I didn't know exactly how I wanted to execute it. So once book two was done, everything just kind of sat there for a while. And then I started going through the process of editing book one, and working on those edits and printing up copies of the chapters, marking them off. And initially, I had an editor that I was working with, and she had some great insight for restructuring some of the stuff in the book. But the way I was applying what I was doing is I wanted there to be lead-ins for what was going to happen next in the next book in the series. So like I would set something up, and there would be payoff in the next book, or payoff 2 books later. I didn't want everything to just happen in the first book. And while I'm a firm believer in applying Chekhov's gun as a motif for making sure that story elements lock in with the audience, ultimately I wanted to draw readers into the world further by like saying, I'm paving the way with these hints and these clues for something that's going to happen in the future. I promise it will be there. Just trust me on this. And so there are things that I alluded to, for example, in book 3, that don't come about until book 5.
Okay.
And so like when it comes to my readers and my potential audience, ultimately my promise to them is I want to entertain them. I want to introduce them to characters that they can enjoy, that they can love, that they can hate in equal measure. And if they come back and they say, hey, I really enjoyed that, then I feel like I've accomplished my task in that.
Awesome. Now, from that point, when did you share with family and friends that you were embarking on this journey, and what was the reaction and feedback like?
I mean, it was probably from the very beginning. Like, well, I was constantly writing stuff in middle school and high school. Always constantly write. Very rarely did I share stories with my family. That didn't start happening until I got into doing storytelling, because my dad was a big reader, my mom not so much. And so like I would share a story that I was working on for storytelling, and I would get some feedback from my dad, because I wanted something that would be interesting, that would catch people's attention, that they'd be willing to listen to as I'm telling it orally in the old-fashioned tradition. But at the same time, it was a great way to share what I was working on with my family. And my dad provided a lot of good feedback. If there was things that I needed help with, as far as like getting an idea across, or maybe there was a plot point that I needed help working out, my dad was usually one of those people. And to this day, I will tell my parents, "Hey, I'm working on this, and this," and they'll be like, "Oh, okay, cool." And with each of the books that I've published, my parents have been very supportive. Like when I do local events and stuff like that, my dad usually comes down and sees what I'm doing. I had at the beginning of April, I had a book signing at Barnes and Noble locally here, and both my parents showed up for that. Mainly because it gave my mom an opportunity to check out the bookstore and see what they had, and go shopping. But they came to support me, and it was really cool. And when I've had events outside of my area, my dad has gone with me to help on occasion. But it's been, for the most part, I don't usually share something unless it's completed. So like if I share a story, I don't share it until afterward.
Right.
I will say though that my mom has gotten more supportive over the last few years, just because she's trying to help me get books out there. Like my parents are traveling right now, and my mom asked for 5 copies of my newest title, so that she could take them with her to get out to people. And I'm like, well, I can't just give them to you. She's like, I'll buy them. How much are they? I'm like, $10 each. She's like, okay, cool. And so she's good about doing that. And so I was able to give her those copies, and I'm sure she's sharing them with as many people as she possibly can. So, but yeah, but when it comes to like extended family, I keep things close to the vest until I'm good and ready to share it with them. By that point, it's already been published, it's already out, and I'm gauging how it's going with readers.
Nice. That's a very good plan to have. And that actually kind of leads into the next question, which on this topic is about, whether to share the work when it's still in production or whether it's completed. And that's a very, I don't want to say difficult thing, but it is definitely one that, every author has to make a choice, because, as authors, we want to share with everybody to let people know what we're working on, especially if it's our first book. However, especially in today's digital age for authors, we do leave ourselves exposed in the sense that, on one hand, we are able to meet up with people who are interested in our stories, who like the kind of stories that we are writing and want to help us any way we can. On the other side of the coin, we unfortunately do leave ourselves exposed to a lot of trolls, spam, hate speech, and a lot of negativity overall, especially when it comes to our first book or first series of books. And of course, the dreaded imposter syndrome is always going to be there in the back of every creative's mind. I don't care who you are, imposter syndrome is always going to be there. So, Garrett, when you began writing your first book in your series, did you have any of those heightened anxiety moments or imposter syndrome feelings when you were writing it before you published it? And what has disciplined you to continue this series? Because it's one thing to write a book and get it out there. It's another thing entirely to stick with the story, to stick with the material and expand on it.
So this is actually something that I discussed in the second season of Storytellers. The theme for that season was called The Danger Zone. And it goes for being a creative, whether you're a writer, an artist, a filmmaker. It doesn't matter what it is that you're doing creatively. The same philosophy applies. And I've never dealt with imposter syndrome. I've always been very comfortable in who I am and what I'm doing. I think where I have struggled has been I have hit moments of writer's block where I feel disconnected from the story, either because I've hit a kind of a roadblock in the structure or the pacing, or I'm trying to execute an idea and I'm not entirely sure how to get around that problem. But there's always going to be something that interrupts. There's always, whether it's your schedule, whether it's your calendar, whether it's your relationships with people. And I think part of the biggest obstacle that I was facing at that point, when I've hit these kinds of roadblocks, usually comes in the form of what's happening in my personal life.
Right.
Now, I will say that I use what is happening in my personal life as far as like when I hit those personal roadblocks as a way to fuel the writing. Sometimes it's an emotional connection. Sometimes it's like for example, in 2017, 2018, when I was in the process of writing book 4 in my series, I was having struggles in my marriage, and the struggles ended up filtering into what I was writing, and so the writing itself became a catharsis to help me deal with the frustrations that I was encountering in the real world, and allowed me to work through it in, I think, a healthy way, without dwelling on it, without ruminating on it so long that it became an obsession. I was able to get it out of my head, find a healthy fictional way of dealing with it, and then being able to move on. But I found other ways of going about working through that. So I'm not a big fan of working out. I don't like exercise for the sake of just like, I don't lift weights just for the sake of lifting weights. I don't run for the sake of just running. I think it's kind of pointless. If that's somebody's, if that's something that they enjoy, great, have at it. I mean, my brother's a personal trainer, or he was, and I'm like, have fun spending 20 hours a day working out. I don't want to do that. But I like when I do stuff around the yard, like the other week I was just pulling out a tree, or I was doing some weeding in the backyard, whatever it is that I'm working on. My mind is going. I'm either listening to music just to have some noise there, or I'm listening to an audiobook. And regardless of what it is, it gives me something to kind of just, as I'm working, I'm able to let my mind just go. And so those creative juices kind of unblock themselves. And it is really helpful. Whether it's a physical meditation that you're doing, or a non-physical meditation, sometimes having that gives you the opportunity to work through those issues. As far as imposter syndrome, there's always going to be people who critique what you're doing. I know that I've looked at some of the reviews I've gotten on my first book, and I had one reviewer on Goodreads a couple years ago say that they didn't like the book because it wasn't spicy enough. Like, they were expecting really graphic sexual content in the story. I'm like, at no point in the blurb on the back of the book does it say anything about this. At no point do any of the chapter headings indicate that there's going to be graphic sexual content. And this is one of the, like, I was talking with someone on Instagram in the last couple of days, where and I'm like, this is why I'm really frustrated with authors like Sarah J. Maas or Rebecca Yarros, because their books have that, that kind of content in them, and it's like, I think it creates an unrealistic expectation of what should be in all fantasy. Right. And I think Game of Thrones, not so much the books, but the show, because it's HBO, and they go for the sexual, the gratuity, or the gratuitous nudity and stuff like that. Like, it sets a very unrealistic expectation for what's actually in the book, or what should be expected from the genre, and that kind of frustrates me. And what's interesting though is, I mean, you're always going to get pushback. It's how you handle the pushback. But even then, I've encountered writers who want to be writers, or at least they say they do. And then they come back and I'm like, well, what have you written? And they're like, well, I haven't written anything. Like there's a guy that locally, it's kind of hard to imagine that he's like pushing 30 because he looks like he's barely out of high school. He's got a very young face. But when I've done local events, he comes and talks to me to just get some pointers and stuff like that. He's like, here's some of my character designs. Here's the background on these characters. This is the world I'm creating. And he's done all this legwork, which is great. But my prompt to him is always, what have you written? Because if you're not writing, you're not being a writer. You're being creative, and that's great. But if your goal is to write a story, write the story. Start writing. And so he starts bagging on himself, and I'm like, do you really want to write, or are you just in love with the idea of being a writer? Because what's funny is a lot of people romanticize the idea of being a writer, and there's nothing romantic about it. There's nothing glorious about it. I mean, we hear the success stories of guys like James Patterson or J.K. Rowling or Sarah J. Maas or, name any right. Anybody who's been on a New York bestsellers list, kudos. But there's a lot of work that goes into it. In fact, that's exactly how my Storytellers podcast started. It actually went under a different name called Creators Corner, which that title was brought in as a segment on my YouTube channel as I started to retool the podcast 5 years ago. But it came from a conversation in late September, early October of 2019, where my brother, the aforementioned former personal trainer, said that writing isn't work. It requires no work at all. And I'm like, you have no idea.
Yeah.
And so I was doing some yard work, and I was ruminating on this whole conversation and how I would have responded to a little bit more time to think about my response. And it just kind of clicked for me. And so I got out my phone, I plugged in my earbuds, and I started recording just off the cuff how it would actually, my philosophy with regards to writing and that. And the very first episode is writing is gardening. You have your planting stage, which is writing everything out. You've got your pruning stage, which is the editing phase, and then you've got the finished product, which is where you are continuing to prepare and take care of whatever it is that you've planted. And there's a lot of work. There's so much work that goes into writing, whether it's the research, whether the character design, the world building. Maybe you're taking a break because you're looking at word choices in a thesaurus and going down that rabbit hole. Whatever it is, there's going to be some level of work, and if you're not willing to do the work, don't be a writer. Don't be creative. It's just like with anything. If you want it to go well, you have to work hard at it.
That is very true, Garrett. That is very true. And that kind of leads almost into now the business portion of being an author. Before I get to that, there was one question I did want to hear your thoughts on. So I've been asking this question with a lot of my guests on the show about whether or not we're in sort of like a golden age of writing or some renaissance of writing. And the reason why I bring this up is that I've seen a lot of my previous guests mentioned or reference the quarantine years as sort of like a reawakening to hidden passions and people rediscovering, what they used to do before everything else took up most of their time. And a lot of people have argued that in some way, the lockdown did lead to a new wave of writers, myself included. I began writing back in 2020, professionally getting 3 of my books published and currently working on my 4th. However, a lot of my guests have also gone forward in saying that, well, the quarantine did create a hub of new writers. We are not necessarily in a golden age or renaissance of sorts, with the idea that most of these books, or at least some of these books that are coming out, are not written with the idea of passion behind them. They're just written just to say, I made a book, here it is. So in your opinion, Garrett, looking at your own journey from the beginning and through the quarantine years as well, do you feel that we are in a golden age or renaissance of some kind, or are we not there yet?
That's kind of it's kind of a Schrodinger's cat situation.
Mm.
It can be both, or it can be neither, or it can be one or the other. And you won't know until you really peel back that lid. I want to say that I have seen a huge in the creative, especially in the literary world, where we've got more indie authors than we've ever had before.
Yes.
It's easier to become an indie author because you can control content through various platforms. You can own the copyright and the IP, whatever it is that you've created. You can also go through the traditional route, which is incredibly daunting. For me and my journey, I've independently published. So the publishing label on my books says GKJ Publishing. It's literally a pun. It's my initials next to the word publishing, because I'm saying I'm publishing. And the like one of the things I mentioned in the second season of Storytellers, when I was doing that whole danger zone theme,
Right.
It was talking about, I did an episode on why people should become writers. And one of the reasons I gave is that we are at a point where, because of social media, because of being able to do things digitally, with where the technology allows us to do it much more easily and for a much lower cost, we are now in a point where, with the connectivity we have worldwide, you can have millions of new people accessing content as well as creating content.
Mm-hmm.
And not everything that's out there content wise is going to be gold. I'm looking at some, I don't use TikTok, but I've seen some of the videos from TikTok on YouTube or Instagram, and it just baffles me how some of these people can become multimillionaires just for doing something stupid.
Mm-hmm.
Or running their mouth. Meanwhile, I'm sitting here trying to do something to legitimately entertain potential readers with a genre that I absolutely love. But it's much harder because I write fantasy. Fantasy is a niche genre, just like science fiction is, or
Right.
even westerns. And most of your audience is either, if they like I said, if they see fantasy, they're going to be like, oh, how spicy is it? Or if you're writing a sci-fi, they want to know, depending on the type of sci-fi subgenre you're writing, what it is. Is it steampunk? Is it cyberpunk? And because if it doesn't fit like a certain list of characteristics, they may not like it. So it's all about knowing how to find your audience, but at the same time, just putting yourself out there. I don't know if it's necessarily a golden age. I do think we are seeing a huge increase in what is available. I think there is some truth to the fact that a lot of people got inspired to write because they had a lot of extra time on their hands,
Mm-hmm.
and they needed something to keep themselves sane instead of just being cooped up with their spouse or their kids all day long. And I get that. But at the same time, people are doing this, and they're they're still working their regular day job, because ultimately, like I said, it's not a romantic profession. It's not a glorious profession. And unless you've got some major success behind your name, it's going to be an uphill struggle, just like with anything.
Mm.
And you just have to find what is good about it and keep plugging for that, because otherwise, like I said, you're going to be finding yourself in a situation where you love the idea of being a writer or a creative more than you actually enjoy doing it. And for me, I love doing it. I love putting pen to paper and sitting down and writing. Do I do it every day? No. But I will take time to work on something when the mood hits me. Like yesterday, so I'll show you. Here's the notebook that I'm working on. I'm working on chapter 24 of book 6. I'm almost to the finish line on this one as far as the writing phase is going. But the yesterday I didn't pick up that notebook or my pen all day. I had other things that I was doing, and I didn't touch it. Picked it up for a little bit today, but it wasn't until like right before we got on here to do our conversation. So, I love writing, but it's not something I'm going to force myself to do if I'm not feeling it.
Absolutely. And that kind of leads into the business portion of the interview. And we're almost nearing the end. So I'm actually going to combine these questions together because some of them actually do flow really well. So ultimately, Garrett, you gave some really great points and kind of answered in some way to these questions. So I'll do them in parts. So the first part, which I think you've touched on, but maybe you can go more in depth, is, not only understanding one's audience, but also, finding the fine line between your individuality as an author, but also understanding the genre that you're in, as well as the stories that have been written in said genre. Because as you said before, when someone writes in a particular genre that's become so popular or one trait, everyone has an unrealistic expectation. And of course, as authors, we want to show our uniqueness, but we also want to understand the audience. That's the first part. Second part is, of course, networking. Networking is very huge. So what are some of the people who have helped you in your journey as an author? Are any special shout outs? And the final one, which I think you really hit the head on, what it is to be an author, the romanticized version of it that, everyone wants to be it, but that's not necessarily the case. It's not easy. It's not something that's a get rich quick money scheme. Are there exceptions to the rule? Are there people who are able to make a career off of their first book or first series? Absolutely. But generally, that's not the case. So as the final question for the third part, if you were working with a fellow writer, or perhaps you're meeting an aspiring writer who want to get into this industry, how would you advise them, saying that, yes, there is no guarantee your book's going to be a success, but it shouldn't be seen as a negative. It should be seen as a positive.
Let's break down each of these questions. So give me the first one of those three.
Okay, so the first one is, and I think you touched on, is understanding your audience, but also showing your uniqueness. Because I think that's it's a tightrope balance, because you want to be unique, you want to be original, but you also want to be respectful to the genre and the audiences tied to the genre.
So, first of all, and this is so I teach creative writing workshops at my local library once a month. And the last few months, I've been covering different genres of literature, not necessarily because I'm an expert at it, but because these are topics that people have asked for, and I want to introduce as much as I possibly can without recycling too much.
Right.
It is like, if you're going to be writing in a genre, it is important to understand that genre, just simply because, like, if you want to write, say, for example, horror, but you don't understand anything about horror, you're not going to get it. You're not going to appreciate it. Like, as a kid, I would not have written anything scary because I didn't like horror. I had an active imagination, and things used to terrify me.
Right.
However, in the writing process, as I became more introduced to the genre and I started finding something to appreciate about it, I started working in the things that used to terrify me into the story. So when you're writing anything, you're going to be putting your personal investment into the story. It doesn't matter if you're writing fantasy or if you're writing science fiction or if you're writing a detective mystery. You're going to put some element of your personality into the writing, whether it's through dialogue or you're writing a particular scene based on something that terrified you, or maybe, and this is something that actually happened. In my second book, I wrote the sequence where my protagonist has rescued this family, specifically their daughter, from being attacked by his enemy.
Right.
And the girl was being held hostage. He fixes the issue. He does get a little bit of help, but he doesn't realize it at the time. And the parents are like, let us reward you. Let us take you back to our home in the next city over, and we'll put you up for the night. That's great. And so they're having dinner in their home, and there's a conversation that takes place between the parents and the daughter and the hero. And I wrote it based on a conversation that happened when I was in high school, where I was hanging out with a friend of mine from school. She was over visiting, and she stayed for dinner, and my parents were talking, and my mom's like, "This is a girl that you should be dating." And very embarrassing for me, but so I flipped it, where the dad is like, "Hey daughter, this guy is someone that you should be getting married to." And just the way the dialogue flows, my dad was reading it right after the book came out, and at 10 o'clock, 10:30, he shoots me a text message. He's like, "Did you write this about me and your mom? Did you base these characters off of me and your mom?" And I'm like, "Oh, absolutely." He's like, "That's funny." So, I mean, you're always going to be so like what makes the story that you're writing unique is the fact that you wrote it. Your personality, your heart, your passion is invested into it. What was the next question?
The next part is, of course, what I think is important for all authors to understand is networking, because especially as indie authors, it's all on our own. And again, this goes back to the idea of like, the romanticized nature of being an author. If you're an indie author, it's a grind because you have to get your own team, which includes an editor, cover artists, beta readers, and ARC readers. It takes a lot, and networking does have its benefits. So are there any people you would like to give a personal shout out to who have helped you along the way? And just very briefly, would you agree that networking is an essential tool that all authors and writers need to have?
So let me cover the networking part first. Yes, networking is essential. Now, if you're the kind of person who's just generally creative, I mean, you can easily find ways around needing a graphic artist or anything like that. A lot of great tools. And unfortunately, with the advent of more active creative AIs, there are a lot of people who are going down that road. Google, for example, has a version of their AI that you can basically plug in the PDF copy of your book, and it will narrate it for you for like an audiobook with voices and characters and stuff like that. And I have seen some authors have done that because it saves them time, saves them having to pay a narrator or doing it themselves. But at the same time, it takes away from the actual creativity and the actual art of making the audiobook. One of the things that I have found most useful in the networking side of things is finding other authors or other creatives who do podcasts like yourself, and saying, "Hey, do you have an opening for an interview?" And one of the things that I have done is when I have been interviewed by a podcast host, I invite them onto my show, either as a guest host or to do an interview themselves. So for example, there's a podcast that I got to guest host back in February called The Speculative Sandbox with Vicky Lon.
Right.
She's an author, podcaster from Arizona, and I've been on her show a couple of other times, and so because she was having me come on in February, I said, "Hey, look, I'm looking for a guest host for June to cover a top 10 book recommendations list and a creative writing tips list. Would you like to come on and do that?" And she's like, "Absolutely." So I've got her content that's going to be coming out in the month of June, but that's one of the great ways of networking, because then you can connect with these other authors, you can connect with these other podcast hosts, and you can find an organic way of getting yourself out there. And so the more you're able to do that, the better it's going to be. And you may not find an audience for your book right away. And I think that's part of the big problem, is that what's funny is a lot of other authors will be like, "Hey, you're an author. Let me pitch my book to you." And it's like, I'm not the market for your book. Other people are. So, know who you're going to be connecting with. But by all means, most of the people that I try to connect with are other authors first and foremost, if anything, so I can invite them onto my show and be like, "Hey, you want to have an opportunity to be interviewed? Doesn't cost you a thing." And so that's kind of my way of networking. And during the conversation, I do plug my books. I talk about what my writers do with them. But when it goes to the when I go to put everything on YouTube, I've cut out the majority of the time where I'm talking, because I want it to be about them. I don't. It's my way of saying, "Hey, thank you for being willing to do this show for free. Thank you for just being awesome, being you, and being creative. Here you go. Let me help promote you as best as I possibly can." As far as, so I've already kind of commented on, I've mentioned Vicky and her podcast, but I do want to give shout outs to a lot of people. Like I've had the privilege of being able to interview a lot of great authors on my YouTube channel. And it was a blessing for me to be able to do that. In fact, I got to interview one of my favorite authors personally, Jonathan Mayberry, who has done work for Marvel Comics. He's got his own series. Like he had one of his graphic novel series on IDW turned into a show for Netflix. Like this guy he's really successful, and I had this opportunity to have him come on my show as a guest. It was great. I also want to give a shout out to Ashley Greathouse. She's an author and graphic artist. She has done with the exception of my newest book, she has done the graphic art for all of the books in my fantasy series. And I am very grateful for her, because she is easy to work with, and she's really fair about how she handles the interaction between me as the person needing her services and what she is doing on her side of that interaction. There are a lot of other authors that I've had the pleasure of being able to partner with, and they've helped share what I work on. And so there's so many different names. And I can't just narrow it down to just a handful. But I think probably some of my biggest encouragers that I get to interact with on a pretty much daily basis are the crew at Feast of Fandoms. They're the podcast network that War of the Stars is a part of. And I'll share stuff with them, and they'll be like, "Yeah, go," and they'll share it on. If I make a post, they'll show it on social media, whether it's their personal one, or they'll do it through the Feast of Fandom's official social media posts. And they're so encouraging, and it's been a blast to get to know these people, because they are some of the best people I've had a chance to talk with.
Awesome. And the final part, the final three, which is probably the most important one, which is, with everything you've learned in your career thus far, Garrett, in a way, what is your word of wisdom to any writer or author who wants to get into this industry, but understand the realities of being an author and what it truly means?
I doubt I have actual wisdom, but let me see what I can do for you. I would say that if you're going to be a writer, understand that it is not a glorious job. It's fun if you enjoy it, but it's not. If you're coming at it trying to be this famous author, there's a lot more work involved than you realize. It's not going to be easy. There are going to be times where you absolutely hate it, where the idea of sitting down to write, or the idea of sitting down to do edits, or the idea of simply drafting a book blurb for the back cover is going to give you so much anxiety that you'd rather chew off your fingernails rather than do anything else. But at the same time, if this is something that you feel compelled to do because you've got this itch that needs to be scratched, jump into it. Don't hold back. Don't second guess yourself, because the moment you second guess yourself, you're going to spiral through that anxiety and you're not going to get anything done. Second, be a reader as much as you are a writer. One of the things I say in my writing workshops, and I say this on my show often enough on YouTube, read as much as you write. Reading is breathing in. It's the inhalation of creativity. Writing is the exhalation. It's the breathing out. And it doesn't matter what you read. Read widely. Read a variety of different things. I do recommend that if you are going to write in a particular genre, read enough in that genre, whether it's on Kindle, on paperback, on audiobook. It doesn't matter. It's still reading, because you're still taking it in. But read enough of it that you understand the scope of what it is that you're trying to accomplish. Don't just jump into it thinking, oh yeah, I'm going to write this awesome sci-fi story, and you have no idea what you're doing within that particular genre. But also don't be afraid to experiment and mix genres. Sometimes you can get a lot out of that as well. But read widely, read varied. And the reason for that is because when you read fiction, that fuels your creativity. When you read nonfiction, what that does is it fuels your analytical side for how you are handling that information. It allows you to process it in a different way. And so it also boosts your vocabulary either way. And my last little bit of advice on this topic is just write. Just go in there, get it done, and write. Because if you're not going to sit there and write and do the actual work, there's no point in calling yourself a writer. There's no point in jumping in and doing it. So yeah, that's what I'd have to say for someone wanting to break into this line of work.
And I think those are very great and excellent points, Garrett, and a perfect ending to this amazing author's interview here on the show, viewers and listeners. Thank you all so much for joining for another interview here on the show. A huge thank you to Garrett for making his official debut on The Wandering Scribe. Now, Garrett, where can people find you on social media if they wanted to reach out to you? And where can people buy copies of your books?
Well, you guys can find me on Instagram and X at GKJ_publishing. I'm not really on X a whole lot these days, because the last couple of years, it's just kind of whatever. But I still occasionally post. But I'm mostly on Instagram. You can also find me on YouTube. Just do a search for GKJ Publishing. You'll find my show, The Right Way, on there, where we do book recommendations, author interviews, and creative writing tips. I just had an episode come out this last Saturday. I've got another one coming out at the beginning of June, and then I wrap up at the end of July with this current season. As far as my podcasts, they're all linked on my website, which is archivesofthefivekingdoms.com. That website has a calendar of all the stuff I have going on through the summer, and as well as it is a companion site for my books. So like if there's maps that you want to check out for my fantasy series, you can find them there. If there is a character profile that you want to find, it's there. It's all available for free. As far as finding my books, all my titles are on Amazon. Most of them are on Kindle and paperback. I do have one that is just Kindle and audio. And then my newest book, Midnight Playground, which is a collected anthology of short stories, that is already out on paperback and Kindle, but I've got the audiobook coming out later this summer.
Awesome. I will link all those down below in the description of this video. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for another episode this week on the show. Again, a huge thank you to Garrett for making his official debut here on the channel. We wish him the very best with the next book in his series. And as always, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe down below. And until next time, there's the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out. Wishing you all a wonderful day wherever you are in the world. And until next time, we'll see you all in the next episodes next week.